In a hushed courtroom, an elderly man stands accused of trespassing. No lawyer, no defender, just a judge who sees him as a worthless drifter. But with one phone call, he flips the entire room upside down, unveiling a truth no one anticipated. How did a man dismissed as nothing prove that justice isn't always what it seems? Share your thoughts below. Is justice truly blind, or does it favor the powerful? Now let's dive into this remarkable story. The courthouse clock's deep chime reverberated through the grand hallways, each slow, deliberate note a warning. It rang 9 times, signaling the start of another day in courtroom 7, where the air carried the scent of polished wood, old books, and the quiet weight of lives about to be judged. At the bench sat Judge Marcus Varnell, a man who wielded his authority like a blade. 58, broad-shouldered, and always impeccably clad in his black robe. He was a judge who viewed the law as a hammer and every defendant as a nail. Known for his sharp tongue, harsh sentences, and utter disdain for those he deemed society's failures, he adjusted his glasses, scanning the courtroom with cold precision. "Next case," he called, his voice firm, clipped, a voice that had sent countless men to prison, stripped hope from many, and left no room for sympathy. It was more than a summons. It was a declaration. Justice, as he saw it, was swift and merciless. The heavy double doors groaned open, and a figure appeared, an old man, his back slightly bent but his steps steady. Amos Carver, 76, wore simple clothes, a faded flannel shirt, neatly buttoned despite its worn edges, old slacks that had seen better days, and scuffed work boots that once tread stronger paths. His dark skin, etched with years of labor and hardship, bore silent witness to a man who had seen the world change but never truly belonged to it. He removed his cap as he stepped forward, a gesture of respect, though respect was not something he'd receive in return. Murmurs rippled through the gallery. Low voices, hushed whispers, the sound of judgment. Another vagrant. Why bother with these cases? Probably loitering, looking for handouts. Amos had heard those words before, and they wouldn't be the last. He kept his gaze steady, refusing to react. From the bench, Judge Varnell's eyes settled on him, sharp and filled with quiet disdain. He'd seen men like Amos before, men who lived too long in the margins, who carried nothing but excuses, who had squandered life's chances. To him, Amos was just another nobody who'd stepped out of line, and he'd deal with him accordingly. Papers rustled as the assistant district attorney, a young woman in a crisp suit with a measured voice, rose. "Case number 47629, she announced, her tone steady, impersonal. "Just another file in a stack. Amos Carver, charged with criminal trespassing on private property at Silver Lake Estates, a restricted residential community. This is the defendant's second offense in recent months." She paused, glancing at Amos. Security officers found Mr. Carver sitting by the lake on the estate's property. When asked to leave, he refused and was arrested. She set the file down, folding her hands. "The state pursues legal action per trespassing laws." Judge Varnell exhaled through his nose, his patience already thinning. He peered over his glasses, his expression a mix of boredom and irritation. "Let me see if I understand," he said slowly, deliberately. "You were found on private property again?" His tone made it sound like Amos had committed an unforgivable sin. Amos didn't flinch. He stood tall, hands loosely clasped, his face unreadable, exuding a quiet dignity born of enduring far worse. "Yes, Your Honor," he said evenly. Varnell leaned forward, elbows on the bench. "And what exactly were you doing there?" Amos met his gaze without hesitation, his eyes holding quiet certainty. "I was sitting by the lake," he answered. "It's a place that means something to me." The judge blinked, momentarily caught off guard, as if expecting a rambling excuse or empty plea. Instead, Amos's words were simple, honest, but honesty was no shield against judgment. Varnell let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "The lake? You mean the one that belongs to people who actually paid for that property?" His voice dripped with sarcasm, filling the room like a cold draft. Amos didn't respond. He didn't need to. Varnell leaned back, tapping his fingers on the armrest. "You see, Mr. Carver, this is where people like you always get it wrong," he said, shaking his head as if explaining something obvious. "You think nostalgia is an excuse, that because a place is familiar, it somehow belongs to you." He scoffed. "That's not how the world works." Amos remained still, his breath steady. He didn't argue or protest. What was the point? Varnell studied him, waiting for submission. When none came, he sighed. "You've been here before, haven't you?" he said, flipping through the file, a smirk playing on his lips. "Trespassing at Willow Creek Country Club, and now Silver Lake Estates. You seem to have a habit of showing up where you don't belong." He closed the file with a loud thud, a sound that cut through the courtroom like a final judgment. "Tell me, Mr. Carver." Varnell's voice grew colder, eyes narrowing. "What gives you the right to ignore the law, to walk onto someone else's land as if it's your own?" Amos took a slow, controlled breath, then spoke with unwavering calm. "I never said it was mine, Your Honor," he said, his voice quiet yet stronger than anything else in the room. "But it was once a place where I belonged." Varnell's eyes flickered, something unreadable, almost unsettled, but only for a second. Then his expression hardened. "That," he said sharply, "is not how property rights work." He leaned forward, his tone condescending. "The world doesn't operate on sentimental value, Mr. Carver. It doesn't care where you fished as a boy or walked freely. The law is the law, and men like you seem to think that because life hasn't been kind, the rules don't apply." Silence settled over the room. Amos didn't break. Not a muscle twitched. He'd heard those words before, not just here, but from teachers who relegated him to the back, employers who dismissed him, strangers who judged him, officers who stopped him for existing in the wrong place. He'd been told he didn't belong, yet here he stood. Varnell saw none of that. To him, Amos was a trespasser, a waste of time, a man to be put in his place. He sat back, letting out an amused sigh. "Tell me, Mr. Carver," he said, shaking his head, "do you ever tire of playing the victim?" The words landed like a slap, not because they hurt, but because they were so predictable. Amos stood there, hands folded, patient, unmoving. Varnell's smirk widened. "That's what I thought," he muttered, closing the file. He'd made up his mind, and nothing Amos Carver could say would change it. A hush fell over the courtroom, the silence of inevitability. Amos stood alone at the defense table, no lawyer, no advocate. Judge Varnell removed his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose as if this were an inconvenience, as if Amos wasn't worth the air he breathed. He glanced at the file, more for show than necessity. He'd already decided. "Mr. Carver?" he said, tone flat, impatient. "Do you have legal representation?" Amos met his gaze unshaken. "No, Your Honor." Varnell chuckled condescendingly. "Of course you don't." He tapped a finger on the bench, then turned to the prosecutor. "Does the state intend to assign a public defender?" The prosecutor hesitated. "Given the minor nature of the charge, Your Honor, it's unlikely Mr. Carver qualifies for a court-appointed attorney." Varnell nodded, almost smugly. "Exactly." He turned back to Amos, lips pressed into a thin line. "This is a simple case, Mr. Carver. You were caught trespassing. You admit to it. There's nothing complicated here. You don't need a lawyer." The unspoken truth hung heavy. You don't need a lawyer because you've already lost. Amos remained motionless, neither pleading nor protesting. The prosecutor cleared her throat. "Your Honor," she began carefully, "given Mr. Carver's age and the nonviolent nature of the offense, the state recommends a fine or community service in place of incarceration. He has no history of violent crime and poses no threat to public safety. It was reasonable, a fine, some service, a slap on the wrist. But Varnell was not reasonable. He tilted his head, as if considering, but his answer was clear before he spoke. He sighed, shaking his head. "No," he said, voice clipped. "That won't do." Heads turned, startled. The prosecutor blinked. "Your Honor." Varnell silenced her with a hand. Men like Mr. Carver don't learn from a fine, he said, his gaze locking onto Amos, piercing, predatory. They don't learn from picking up trash for a few hours. They need real consequences. He savored the words, then lifted his gavel. I sentence you, Amos Carver, to 30 days in county jail. The air was sucked from the room. Shock rippled through. A gasp here, a pause there. Even the prosecutor's lips parted. No one expected this. Jail for an old man who sat by a lake. Even in a courtroom used to injustice, this felt different. Yet Amos didn't move, didn't react. He'd known from the moment he saw Varnell's eyes that this wasn't about justice. It was about punishment, not for a crime, but for who he was. Varnell leaned back, a hint of satisfaction at the corners of his mouth. This court is adjourned, he said, slamming the gavel. The final sound of a system working as intended. But what Varnell didn't know, what no one knew, was that this case wasn't over. It was just beginning. The gavel's echo lingered like a stone sinking into deep water. The verdict was past 30 days. It seemed the story was over. Amos swallowed by a system too vast, too indifferent to question itself. But Amos didn't beg or protest. He didn't look to the prosecutor or the uneasy spectators. Instead, he turned his gaze to the judge, no anger or desperation in his eyes. Only patience, a patience that made even Varnell hesitate. Then, in a steady, almost polite voice, Amos spoke. Before I'm taken away, he said, may I make one phone call? It wasn't a fearful request or a desperate plea. It was a statement, a quiet formality, as if tying up a loose end. Varnell blinked, then laughed, a sharp, condescending chuckle. He leaned forward, smirking. A phone call? He repeated, amused. Amos said nothing. Varnell studied him, then sighed theatrically. Fine, he said, waving a hand. Call whoever you want. His smirk widened. But don't expect it to change a damn thing. Chuckles broke out in the gallery. A bailiff, uninterested, handed Amos a phone. Amos took it with a quiet nod, then dialed. The room fell silent, curiosity prickling. Amos held the phone to his ear, listening to the dial tone. Once, twice, then a soft click. The line connected, and in a voice steady as stone, he spoke 4 words. It's time. Bring them. That was it, no explanations, no desperation. He handed the phone back with another polite nod, as if confirming a routine matter, then sat down. Varnell watched, waiting for a flicker of emotion, fear, anything. But Amos just sat, hands folded, breathing even, as if he knew what was coming. Varnell felt an unsettling creep in his chest but dismissed it. What could happen? He'd seen men fight sentences. Angry, desperate men who screamed about injustice, begged, blamed the world. But this wasn't desperation. This was something else, something Varnell couldn't name. He cleared his throat, reached for his gavel. This court is adjourned, he said, voice firm. But even as the courtroom stirred, murmurs, shuffling papers, creaking benches, those 4 words hung like an omen, a storm waiting to break. The air settled into uneasy stillness. Murmurs faded, papers were filed, and spectators began to leave, ready to move on. To them, the case was over, just another old man lost to the system. Varnell reached for the next file, ready to erase Amos Carver from his mind. Then the doors burst open. The heavy wooden doors swung wide, cracking the silence like a gunshot. Every head turned, every movement halted. Through the doorway, heels clicking sharply on marble, walked a woman who didn't belong to the defeated. Tall, poised, commanding, dressed in a sleek black suit that fit like armor. She moved with confidence that demanded no permission. Lena Carver, 42, attorney, CEO. A woman who entered rooms where she wasn't expected and left them transformed. Her dark eyes locked onto the bench, and for the first time Marcus Varnell felt something other than control. It was subtle, a shift in the air, an unease despite his walls. He wouldn't show it. He straightened, adjusting his robe. This court is adjourned, he said, sharper, more final. If she heard, she didn't care. She wasn't here for permission. She was here for justice. Behind her, 3 men followed, each carrying thick leather briefcases embossed with a logo that made some gasp. Sterling and Holt LLP, one of the state's most powerful law firms. Attorneys in the gallery shifted. They knew the name, knew what it meant. Varnell felt it too. A prickle of doubt. His hands curled into the armrests, but his face remained impassive. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his voice firm but lacking its usual edge. Lena didn't rush. She walked with purpose, stopping before the defense table, her presence casting a shadow over her father. Amos didn't turn. He didn't need to. He'd been waiting. Lena placed a hand on his shoulder, a silent gesture of respect, then faced the man who'd sentenced her father to jail. Her expression was unreadable, her voice sharp, crisp, unshaken. "I have documents I believe you need to see before my father is taken into custody." The courtroom held its breath. Varnell narrowed his eyes, a defense mechanism. "I don't see what good that will do," he said, a tightness in his voice. "Mr. Carver has been sentenced unless—" Lena placed a folder on the bench, not softly, not aggressively, but with the precision of a winning move. "Just open it, Your Honor." She didn't plead or argue. She stated, because she knew what was inside, and she knew he would too. Varnell hesitated, then snatched the folder with a flicker of impatience and flipped it open. His breath hitched. The color drained from his face. His fingers tightened around the pages as if gripping them could change the words. The courtroom watched, and for the first time in his career, Marcus Varnell was speechless. His eyes scanned the documents, flickering over the text like a man grasping for something solid as the ground gave way. But there was nothing to hold on to. This was real. The air felt thick, as if the walls leaned in to listen. Varnell's knuckles whitened, his breath barely audible. What he read shattered everything he thought he knew about the man before him. For too long, Varnell had prided himself on sizing people up the moment they entered his courtroom. Amos Carver he'd seen as a man past his prime, with nothing but poor decisions, a trespasser, a burden. But the truth was a knife cutting deep. Amos Carver was not homeless, not a drifter or vagrant who'd wasted his life. He was a former NASA engineer who'd helped design systems that sent astronauts into space, a renowned inventor with patents that revolutionized industries. More than that, he was one of the largest private donors to the state's judicial system, the very system that had just sentenced him without a second thought. Varnell's heartbeat thudded in his ears. The room tilted slightly, but the final revelation, at the bottom of the page, made his throat go dry. Amos Carver owned the land he'd been arrested on. The courtroom was silent. Not boredom or disinterest, but the silence before a storm. Every attorney, clerk, and spectator sat frozen, eyes locked on the bench, on the judge whose expression had shifted from arrogance to horror. Lena Carver stood still, her face unreadable. She didn't need to speak. The documents had spoken, her father had spoken. Now it was Varnell's turn, but he couldn't. What could he say? That he'd mocked the man before him, sentenced the person who funded his courtroom, dismissed a man not for what he'd done but for what he assumed. The words sat on his tongue like stones. His jaw tightened, hands curled into fists. For the first time, Marcus Varnell was speechless. He'd spent his life passing judgment, and now judgment had found him. The silence stretched, suffocating, alive with realization. For the first time that morning, Varnell had lost control. The truth bore down like a gavel, final, irreversible, damning. Then Amos Carver moved. Slowly, deliberately, he rose, his spine straight despite the years. He looked up, and for the first time it was the judge being judged. Their eyes met. Amos's gaze steady, unwavering, not angry, not pitying, just true. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet power of a man with nothing left to prove. "Tell me, Your Honor," he said, his words cutting through the charged air. "Do you still think I was trespassing?" Whispers spread like wildfire. Murmurs, gasps, shifting feet, then growing. Attorneys exchanged wide-eyed glances. Clerks paused mid-sentence. Even the bailiffs shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't just a case anymore, it was an exposé, the fall of a judge in real time. Somewhere in the gallery, a reporter's phone buzzed, then another. News was spreading. Judge Marcus Varnell falsely sentences one of the state's most respected engineers and benefactors to jail. In a world where headlines moved faster than justice, this was a scandal with consequences. Varnell sat frozen. For years, he'd been untouchable, dictating fates with a flick of his wrist, a stroke of his pen, a slam of his gavel. But today, his own fate unraveled before him. He opened his mouth to argue, deny, salvage his authority, but nothing came. The documents were indisputable, the facts laid bare. Amos Carver hadn't raised his voice, yet he'd dismantled a man who'd believed himself untouchable. Varnell's fingers twitched, his throat dry. His own rules had failed him. There was no sentence, no law to undo this. This wasn't about a verdict anymore. It was about the man he'd been exposed to be. Reporters were already typing. State judge caught in unjust sentencing scandal. NASA engineer jailed. An unbelievable court mistake. Amos Carver, the man who exposed a broken system. Varnell knew it. His grip tightened on the gavel, wishing he could unstrike a decision. But there were no takebacks. This was about justice, power, and how we judge others. Share the story, and let us know, was justice truly served?